why are we in Britain so stupid that we allowed people like former Hamas military commander in the West Bank to live in London? Why? What did we in Britain get out of allowing terrorists to live in our midst?
Douglas Murray speaks, as usual, for the British people in a way the government never will, as he did again in this recent Piers Morgan interview. They tried to have him cancelled after they tried to say these comments incited the recent riots.
I think I know that the British soul is awakening and stirring with rage at what these people are doing. These people came into our house. Many of them broke into our house illegally. Many of them were never wanted here. I don't want them to live here. I don't want them here. In the UK, it's different. Our police force behave differently, and policing by consent and all of these sorts of things. But clearly they've lost control of the streets. Now, is it time to send in the army at some point? Probably yes. But if the army will not be sent in, then the public will have to go in, and the public will have to sort this out themselves. And it'll be very, very brutal.
That is not incitement. He says what will happen, not you should go out and make it happen. There is a big difference. These same people are always trying to blame the right-wing media for stirring all this anti-immigration sentiment up. As Marie said, much of the blame lies with the liberal elite who refuse to acknowledge people's concerns. They want to carry on as normal and silence anyone who speaks out. Well, no, people will not accept this insanity as the normal order of things. And if the mainstream media won't cover it, someone else will. The best bit, however, is when he says, how on earth, as a country, have we got ourselves in the position where we are worrying about whether hundreds of thousands of people on a pro-Palestine march are going to desecrate our war memorials or not on Remembrance Weekend? In the end, they didn't, as they took another route away from those memorials. But that's not the point. It's Remembrance Weekend, and these people are out marching on the streets of London, waving Palestine flags. As pointed out, you'll never see a British flag. And that's because they couldn't care less about Britain. All those who died for us in the Great Wars mean nothing to them. In many cases, they are even openly hostile to Britain and its history. He says that is down to immigration, and that is true regarding the Muslims and immigrants on the protest. But it is also down to the infiltration of society by far-left ideology. Kids are now being brainwashed with this anti-British nonsense in school. We were asked if we wanted this kind of mass immigration and diversity, and the British people have said no time and time again. But those in power ignored that vote and voice. Now, Murray simply says, we shall see how the consequences of that play out in the future.
People like Tommy Robinson and Andrew Tate and others who were fueling complete disinformation about who had perpetrated the crime. And as a result, large numbers of thugs came out, right-wing thugs, to exact revenge against people who had nothing to do with it, which were Muslim communities, people living in asylum seeker hotels or mosques containing Muslims and so on.
I said, why are we in Britain so stupid that we allowed people like former Hamas military commander in the West Bank to live in London? Why? What did we in Britain get out of allowing terrorists to live in our midst? Why is the former Deputy Prime Minister of Iran, who wrote the book justifying the murder of the British novelist Salman Rushdie, why did the man who wrote the book justifying and calling for the murder of a British novelist, why is he living in London? Why has he been living in London for the last 20 years? What has Britain got out of this? Why are we so crazy in Britain that we would give sanctuary to people who want our way of life over? And I've still never had a response to that question. I've asked it for many years, and I've written extensively about it, and I still cannot understand how a society can be so insane that it can welcome in people who want to destroy it. But let's park that for a second. the situation in Southport is, as you say, it's a very interesting example of what can happen with social media. But the Southport thing is extremely important to linger on for a moment, because actually it goes back to something we were talking about earlier. Southport was such a heinous crime in an area where, I mean, unfortunately, we've got sort of used to terrorist attacks in some of our major cities. But an appalling, brutal attack like this on the weakest and most vulnerable target is something which so horrifies people that, of course, they scour around looking for people to blame. Now, we'll see when the trial comes up if there were any motivations or, as it were, inspirations for this vile young man who did this. But I have to say, having covered a lot of terrorist incidents in my life, one of the things that anyone who's wise knows is just wait, and see who is responsible before you start sounding off. And unfortunately, there's lots of people who don't have the discipline to do that. Some people who, in the immediate aftermath of something, are just, as I say, scouring for people to blame. I think that there are several lessons to be taken from this, though. One is, we cannot be in a situation in our society, in Britain or anywhere else, where we are only one madman's attack from responses like this happening. I have argued for decades now that if we had a sensible asylum policy and a reasonable immigration policy, and we didn't allow thousands of people to come into the country illegally every few months, that, we could have a reasonable kind of migration policy like we had in the 1990s, when tens of thousands of people were net migration a year. We don't have that situation in Britain now. We do have thousands of people coming illegally all the time and never being returned. And we had net migration of almost 750,000 in the last year of a Conservative government that had promised in election after election to bring immigration, net legal migration, down to 1990s levels. And they didn't. Labour, Conservative, the Liberal Democrats, all in government, promised to bring down net migration and to stop illegal migration, and instead they ramped it up and ramped it up and ramped it up. The consequences of that are totally predictable. When people say now that my book, The Strange Death of Europe, was prophetic, I say it wasn't prophetic. You didn't need to be a prophet to see the loss of trust in society, the scouring around for people to blame, the much more. You didn't need to be a prophet to see that. You just had to have your eyes open and be willing to say what you saw with them. And too few people were willing to do that. And when you have a situation like Southport, it reminds you that the situation which our politicians have created in Britain is such that you are only one madman's behaviour away from having significant civil unrest. And the problem for the Starmer government is they resurrected the EDL, that, as I understand, has not existed as an organisation for 10 years, and they've been desperately trying to say that these were coordinated and people were coordinated. And that was, by the way, why I got sort of dragged into this madness, was because people were desperate to have people they could say were responsible for the terrible outrages that happened in communities across the north of England, including, by the way, Muslim gangs of Muslim men caught on camera, some of them with weapons, some of whom, by the way, were being advised by a policeman to leave the weapons in the mosque so that they didn't get into trouble. And that's an amazing thing to see, but again, kind of to be expected. But what is it about our society that people were looking for people who they could say had coordinated this? I would say it's much worse than that. Would that there were clear coordinators here, because you could go after the people. But there weren't, Piers. As I understand it, from what I can see, this was angry crowds of people that sometimes became mobs, and they weren't coordinated. That is much harder and much more worrying, because
I would take slight issue. Okay,
and the rest don't seem to know what to do about it.
I would take slight issue, because I think when you have massive followings on social media like Andrew Tate, and I challenged him about this before I went away, and we had a pretty robust exchange.
Yeah.
But also Tommy Robinson, who's been allowed back onto X by Elon Musk, which I don't think was a good decision, but we can debate that another time. But when they have these big followings and they are actively promoting completely wrong information, suggesting that the perpetrator was an illegal Muslim immigrant to the country on a terror watch list, that's when the trouble starts. I suppose my question for you, Douglas, would be, well, let me just ask you a question for you, which is this. I accept that what you said in this clip had nothing to do with what was happening, and it was ridiculous that it got brought in. The point I would pick you up on is, on a second occasion, you posted on X ahead of a planned pro-Palestine march on Remembrance Sunday last year. They plan to defame our war dead and desecrate the cenotaph. If such a march goes ahead, then the people of Britain must come out and stop these barbarians. And I would simply ask you, on both of these cases, you appear to be advocating directly for mob rule to take part if it comes to it. And I'll give you the chance to explain what you really mean if that's not the case. But you have a big position of influence. I think you're a very, very smart guy. I love having you on the programme. I love talking to you. It's been a great conversation today. But when you say things like the people of Britain must come out and stop these barbarians, or the public will have to sort this out themselves, do you see that there is a peril there in somebody like you with a big following appearing to advocate mob rule?
Well, of course I'm not for mob rule. Look, why is our country in this position, Piers? Why is it that tens of thousands of people, in fact hundreds of thousands sometimes, were shutting down the centre of London week in, week out, something, by the way, the French government wouldn't allow in Paris, but was happening week in, week out, with people being intimidated on the streets of London and other cities, with anti-Semitic and racist abuse from these marchers every single week, all the time. Nobody in government just sort of said, look, okay, we get the point, right, but you don't have the right to intimidate people. Why do we have people outside Westminster Abbey calling out jihadist chants? Why do we have people on the streets of London some of whom I've seen you countering on your show, calling for jihad on the streets of London? Why are we in this position that on the 11th of November, on the day that is most sacred to the British soul, where we remember our forebears who fought for our freedom, that we should have a threat of hundreds of thousands of people who hate Britain, who never, ever carry a British flag, would never, ever do anything that is patriotic for Britain? Why are we in this situation in Britain? I would tell you why. Again, it's because our government has lost control of the borders for years. And now we are a very low trust, very febrile society in Britain, where we used to be very high trust and where we didn't used to be at risk of having riots at any moment because of one madman anywhere in the country. We're in this situation because generations of politicians of all parties have brought us here. That is on them. But my question is always, why has it got to be always a one-way street on the toleration? We are forever being told about how tolerant we have to be. But it seems to me that the people saying that are highly intolerant of us and our traditions. The reason why the cenotaph matters is because it is a holy place in the British psyche. The reason why the statue of Churchill, which is always being attacked, is so sacred to us is because it speaks to the sacrifice of our forebears. And the knowledge that we in Britain are a good country, who have been a force for good in the world, overwhelmingly. And that we have people in our country now who do not believe in that, who believe we have been a force for evil in the world, who march against our country, who threaten to despoil our holy places and our very identity. The British public should not endlessly be putting up with being insulted and defamed. And my belief is that we have the right to stand up for our traditions and a right to stand up for our holy places and our holy days. And that the situation we're in is that if anyone does say we must, if people are going to threaten to attack the cenotaph, we should defend it, people will say the people who defend it are far-right extremists. By the way, something they would never say against the people, the other way around, who would deface the cenotaph. So, we have been transformed as a society into an incredibly febrile, low-trust society. And as Nadim Zahawi said in the Times the other week, he wrote a piece where he mentioned me, and he said that Douglas Murray has said for years that what is now happening would happen. And as he said, I never did it in the spirit of glee. I did it in deep lamentation. I did it in deep lamentation because I could see what was being done to Britain and the British people. And I warned against it. And Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrats, SNP and others all just merrily went along the way of making our society something different. I never wanted that. I don't think the British people wanted that. We never voted for that. When we were asked whether we wanted it, we said no. And they didn't listen. So we'll see what happens in the years ahead. And we'll see if Starmer and co have any idea of how to solve the problems that generations of politicians have caused in Britain. But no, I did not want to be in a society in Britain where we have jihadists living in our midst, where we have terrorists that we welcome in, where we give every advantage to people who hate us, or at the very least do not like us. I never wanted that to be the case. I'm extremely sad that it is the case. I'd love to see it turned around. I know how it could happen. I have very low belief that we have anyone in charge in Britain who knows what to do about this. But it's a problem they've brought on our society, and I profoundly wish that they had not.